next session is a presentation from Dan Brocklebank from Orbis. So Dan is a director with Orbis, and he's been with Orbis for 17 years. And I asked Dan to talk today about pricing because we have a regulator who insists it is not a pricing regulator, but is trying as hard as it can to force price competition through disclosure and any other means it has at its disposal. And we also understand that the FCA are doing the rounds to push asset managers to rethink their pricing structures, and raised in the asset management market study their concern that there's clustering of charging, but also charging structures. So we wanted Dan to present an alternative view, and I know that many of you in the room will disagree with performance-based pricing. So I hope you will participate fully after his remarks and ask some questions. Dan.
Thanks very much, Heather. So thank you, Heather, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with you. It's an honor to be on this stage, frankly. My only slight trepidation with being here today is that in the prep call with Heather for this event, she told me that the last time she was here, the speaker somehow managed to bring a horse onto this stage. Hard as that is to believe, the horse then took the opportunity of the speech to empty its bladder, presumably somewhere about where I'm standing now. Anyway, I promised Heather, particularly those of you in the front row, to be reassured. I promise not to try and repeat the horse's trick. Anyway, instead of that, I'm going to start by taking you on a journey to the other side of the world. And nobody's mentioned the B word today, and I'm not about to, but I want to take you back in time to a period in history when, arguably from a political front, we weren't confronted by chaos, and we may even have punched slightly above our weight. Because as hard as it is to imagine in today's political chaos, for about 90 years, this tiny island nation of ours managed to govern the entirety of this landmass from London. And during that period, so the story goes, in the city, the great city of Delhi, the residents of that city were affected by a plague. It was a plague of these things, deadly cobra snakes. Now, in order to try and confront this problem, the British governor of the city hit upon an innovative idea. He said, I'm going to provide the residents of the city with an incentive, a reward for capturing the cobras. And for a while, his scheme worked. The number of dead cobras captured and handed in piled up, and life in the city got marginally better for the residents of that city. However, he hadn't banked on the entrepreneurial spirit of the local population, some of whom very quickly realized that the farming of cobras had just become exceptionally profitable with this scheme in place. The number of cobras started to accelerate quite dramatically because it was a lot easier to kill ones that were asleep in their cages. Eventually, the British realized that they had a very different problem on their hands a few months later, and they abruptly cancelled the scheme, at which point all the cobra farmers released their snakes into the city. The cobra problem was far worse at the end of this. It is a textbook example, if not the textbook example, of how incentive schemes can have very unintended consequences. And the greatest living guru or expert in the field of incentives, I would argue today, is Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's longtime business partner. And as always, he has a pithy saying which summarizes that story. And on incentives, he said, never ever think about something else when you should be thinking about the power of incentives. Ladies and gentlemen, the fee structures that investment firms have between them and their clients are the incentive structures that govern the investment industry. Those structures have the ability to inform and shape the actions both of portfolio managers, but also of owners of investment management firms. If you want to understand the industry, let alone change it, you have to start by understanding those incentive structures. The good news, when it comes to active or investment management, those incentive structures are not rocket science. And they basically boil down to this equation: revenues equals assets under management times fee percentage. Anyone who's worked in investment management will know that costs tend to be quite sticky. And so if you want to increase the profits of your business, you have to increase the right-hand side of that equation, which leaves you with two variables to worry about. Fee percentages are very hard to change at the best of times. In the current environment, they're not going up. So if you want to increase your revenues, you have to focus on increasing assets under management. Now, if you own an asset management firm and you want to increase assets under management, well, there are three pretty obvious steps. Firstly, you want to avoid losing existing clients. And that means, above all, don't run your portfolios too differently from the index, because you want to avoid either long or sharp periods of underperformance, which scare your clients and force them to redeem. Second thing you want to do is to launch as many funds as possible. That's because the sales force will always have something that's in vogue or in fashion in order to be able to sell. And finally, you want to increase the sales force. The easiest thing you can do is to just increase the amount of funds in existing funds. And we all know that increasing assets under management by 5% is a lot easier through sales and marketing activities than it is to tell your portfolio managers that you'd like them to generate an extra 5% this year. Now, all of those activities would be fine if you were the client of a passive investment firm, because none of those actions would impact the returns that you're likely to receive. However, I put it to you that clients of active firms should be very concerned if they see their manager doing these things. Because at the end of the day, we know that successful asset managers tend to exhibit the opposite traits. They tend to have portfolios which differ very substantially from the benchmark. They tend to be focused on a small number of funds. And above all, they tend to be mindful of their ultimate investment capacity. And the reason, when it comes down to active management, at the end of the day, size and distractions are the enemy of performance. To visualize why this is the case very simply, imagine you're running a portfolio and your portfolio is actually a boat. If I said to you, you've got to change direction, which of these two vessels would you rather be driving? The incentive structures of our industry force managers to become large and diversified, when surely their clients would prefer their managers to remain small and nimble. Ladies and gentlemen, I put it to you, we have a pretty fundamental problem here. We're not quite rewarding the breeding of poisonous snakes, but we're incentivizing assets under management growth, which is not the same as what clients want at the end of the day. Despite all of that, I see many of you in the room today, I know, would be skeptical that this would change. I think this is the established pattern, and I know I'm very aware that there are some strong vested interests in preserving the status quo. Despite all of that, as Nelson Mandela has just told you, I'm optimistic, and it always seems impossible till it's done. And the reason I'm optimistic is that I think there's an industry mega trend which is pushing the industry and pushing for change in this direction. What is that mega trend? We've heard a lot about it today. It is, of course, the rise of the passive industry and the rise of passive vehicles. You all have seen this data in various guises. The key things about the rise of passive is that this is a global phenomenon. Each of those lines show the increasing share of passive funds in different regions around the world. You can see the trend is pretty much the same. And this is a well-established trend. That graph goes back to 2007, as you all know. Now, why does the rise of passive matter when it comes to the fee debate? Well, passive funds have basically shown investors that they can get the market average returns essentially for free. The rise of Walmart funds is forcing active investors to think about and have to justify the value for money that they offer for their clients. After all, as an investor, if you can get the market average for free, why do you or your advisor want to go to all the trouble of appointing an active manager? So how have people responded to this trend? Well, don't need to tell any of you in this room that the default response has been to push for ever lower fees. And this makes perfect sense, at least in the short term, both for fund managers who want to preserve their clients, but also for investors. But what it doesn't do is doesn't solve the structural problems at the core here, the conflict of interest between the clients and the fund manager. In fact, I would argue that in pushing for lower fees, you actually exacerbate the problem. Because if you think about what the owner of investment firms are going to do, faced with a cut in fees, their urgency to replace their revenues by gathering more assets is only going to be increased. So I put it to you today that there is, in fact, a better, albeit very different solution, which is to transfer the fee risk to managers. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about how fees are calculated today, whatever percentage of assets under management they're set, the client pays them regardless of performance. So the client is bearing all of the fee risk they pay it regardless. If we step back and say, what is the real prize on offer here? I think it's a big one. What if we could fundamentally transform the relationship that clients have with the investment industry? I think, as we all know, the fee proposition today basically boils down to this. Heads, we, the manager, win. Tails, you, the client, lose. What if we could move that to something along the lines of this? We, the manager, only win if you, the client, win. I think that's a fundamentally better proposition, and I think it is possible. But it does involve a material shift from where we are today. And that shift is that performance-related charging has to be part of the solution. And the reason for that is very simple, and it comes down to a quirk in asset management, which is quite unlike any other product or service that you may buy. When you engage with an investment manager, nobody knows or can know upfront what the value is that they are going to deliver. It's simply impossible to know. So if you set a fee based on a percentage of assets under management, it's only really a guess as to whether or not that will be good value. And yet the client is going to pay it regardless. Now, I don't have time to go into all of the details here today, so I want really just to leave you with two parting thoughts. The first is that you don't have to take my word for this. In a paper published last year, the largest pension scheme in the world set out their thinking. It's a 12-page paper, highly worth a read. It's by GPIF, which is Japan's government pension scheme. They manage, just for context, £1.4 trillion in assets. And their paper, in a nutshell, basically says, enough is enough. The industry's fee structures are out of whack, and we are bored with paying fees, we're fed up with paying fees, regardless of the performance that we're getting. And they are in the process, I should say, of fundamentally and radically overhauling the fee structures that they have in place with the active managers. I think this will have big ripple effects, as do they. GPIF fully appreciates that the new structure will have a big impact on the asset management sector as a whole. The second thought I want to leave you with is probably just as important, and that is that the innovative fee structures that you're seeing emerging today from the likes of GPIF, and I would say from us at Orbis, are not, and I can't say this emphatically enough, they're not a return to the bad old days of 2 and 20 hedge fund model. That is not the solution, that is not a good outcome, and I certainly would not advocate for that. Again, I don't have time to go into all of the details. Instead, I wanted to leave you with a checklist for things to think about when confronted with a new fee structure. And they're all pretty obvious, basically. Start with the fund's objective. Does that tie in with what the benchmark is? Look out for low hurdle rates. Is the manager being sufficiently demanding in what they have to deliver? Fourthly, compare the base fee to a passive alternative. So if the manager just performs in line with the benchmark, will they be more expensive, the same, or cheaper than a passive alternative? The latter is a possibility, by the way. And then finally, if the manager is proposing that the fees go up if they do a good job, will they also be penalized, and how will they be penalized if they subsequently do a poor job? So I promised I'd end roughly on time, so I'm going to pause there just with one conclusion, which is really that there's a big prize on offer here. The industry is faced with a modern-day version of the COBRA problem. There is a fundamental conflict of interest between the interests of the clients, who care about net of fee performance, and the owners of investment management firms, who care about growing AUM. If we're under pressure as a fund management industry, we're under pressure to deliver value for money. If you want to entrench that in the industry, you have to link fees somehow to the performance actually delivered. The good news is that you can actually kill two birds with one stone and deliver much better client outcomes for clients. I think the prize for that is not just improving the outcomes for clients, but it might also be a significant step to restoring some much-needed trust in the industry. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. On your feet, on your feet.